Hello, all, and a warm welcome to you who are with us today. ATS ANAH is an ongoing initiative to expand the interdisciplinary studio narrative in methodology and pedagogy here at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, curated by Bopa Hull and me, Yebet Hong. I'm joined here today with Professor Delinda Collier and will be moderating the talk with Amelia Worthington.
Thank you, Yebet. I'll just give a brief bio of Delinda. Delinda Collier teaches in the Art History, Theory, and Criticism Department and is Interim Dean of Graduate Studies at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Her research interests are in media art in Africa, we'll talk about that later, Luso-African art, and Cold War modernisms. She is the author of Repainting the Walls of Linda, Information Colonialism and Angolan Art, and the newly released Media Primitivism, Technological Art in Africa, which is the basis of our discussion today. It's a great read. I read almost all of it last weekend, which was a trip. But if you're from SAIC and would like to access it, Flaxman is offering the book as an online download. On another note, we encourage you all to submit questions to us live during our conversation, which we will address in the last 15 minutes or so.
Before we begin, I do want to acknowledge members from the brilliant ANAH team, Audrey Awa, Stella Kwan, and Justin Guzman for bringing our vision to life. And I also wanted to give a really special thank you to Laura Lamb, Jennifer Dorothy Lee, Nora Taylor, and Jed Morrissey. We remain sincerely grateful for SAIC Student Government, the Department of Art History, Theory, and Criticism, and the Department of Art and Technology Studies who have made the series possible. Welcome, Delinda.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, or just in the same place that I have been for about 6 months. How are you both?
Doing pretty well.
Yeah,
All right.
doing pretty good.
Okay. Well, I've had Amelia in my class, and so we have a kind of a banter that happens, and I'm really getting excited to get to know you a bit more. So how do you want me to just start kind of giving an overview, or? Okay.
Yeah, sure. That sounds good.
So they asked me to kind of give an overview of the book, which I've told them that I'm pretty terrible at doing. But nevertheless, this is a book that I've been working on for about 10 years, as you know, books often go. And it was really begun while I was still writing my first book specifically on Angola, because I became really interested in the role of media objects, things like record players, tape recorders, cameras, but the concept of media within the plight of colonization in Africa. And to me, it was kind of a lesser researched topic. People always mentioned it, but they didn't really kind of examine it closely. And so that became a focus of the first book, but I didn't have enough kind of time to flesh it out fully. So this book came as a result of that, the unanswered questions, but also my growing interest in what we can loosely call new media art in Africa. And so just following various digital art scenes there, music scenes, DJ art, you know, anything that well, we can talk about that idea of kind of an expanded media in a bit. So it also comes from a class that I've taught for several years at the school, a graduate course called Not Enough Africa and Computers, which is a riff on a kind of a statement that Brian Eno made in the 90s about computers being too white and male. And his offhanded and kind of jokey remark really struck me, because it was encompassing all of the stereotypes of Africa, that it's unmediated, that it's natural, that its art is much closer to the earth or to the social body, whatever the case may be. But and on the other hand, that it can fix what he was calling kind of a sick or broken technology system in the West. So it comes from that series of classes. So students really gave me a lot of input over the years that I took into account. And so right off the bat in the intro to the book, which was written after most of the chapters, which I think we should talk about, the intro really gets into the deep kind of conceptual baggage of the three fields that this book is taking on. That is art history, technology history, or new media or media studies, very loose, and African studies. So like area studies, geographical specificity. And in my attempt to braid those three fields, they're really all major fields together, I attempted in this introduction to really get at the conceptual meat of what is mediation in each of those three fields. And so, it's the intro is a heavy lift, as I think both of you noticed. And right off the bat, I get into just this concept of primitivism and the concept of the fetish and the history of the fetish, two very fraught terms when it comes to art, but two terms that are really foundational to art history and modernism. So fetish is really foundational to art history as it's been told through the lens of Western art history, and primitivism, which is of course foundational to discourses of modernism. And so off the bat, also then the argument is that art, all three of these fields have become, or they were from the beginning, racializing mechanisms. That modernism conjugates bodies in particular ways. It conjugates them into race, gender, sexuality, etc. But that it hierarchizes those in the process. And so the introduction also is an extended argument about racism in each of these three fields. So it's a deep dive. But what I really wanted to do is to dispel the notion that race and gender are sort of these stable biological, categories outside of tech or outside of technology, and to really argue that technology and its development is doing this work of gendering and racializing. And so they grow up together throughout modernism. What else did I write down here? But yeah, I mean, the rest of the book is not, I think it's a lot funner to read. I think the chapters are funner. Each of them takes on one particular piece generally, but then builds out kind of histories around them. And I tried to get to what I thought were foundational pieces to enter this discussion. The earliest is a sound art, an electronic sound artwork from Egypt. And that's now considered the first work of electronic sound ever. And to get to, within those chapters, get to the work of building out new genealogies of media art. And so to kind of take seriously what I asked everybody else to do in the introduction, which is to say that there are extra Western histories of technology that are largely ignored within media history and theory. And so, so I had a lot of fun writing the chapters and not so much fun writing the introduction, but I think all of it together, I don't know, we can talk about how it came together. So is that good?
Yeah, that was great. So I have a couple of just kind of establishing questions to talk first about the concept of new media as you write about it. So in it, like talking about how new media is outdated or was always an inaccurate term, how do you propose that we look at the kind of media it entails, like the term new media? So I think new media, and I try to give us a pithy example in the afterword. When I talk about Queen Nzinga in Angola in the 17th century, which is what nobody would call that a new media time period. But what I did was to say that she had this object of that contained ancestors' ashes that was incredibly sacred to her, to the culture that she came from. And when she converted to Christianity out of political and personal reasons, the church asked her to melt that box down and make it into a cross. And I said, okay, the box is old media, the cross is new media, right? And they were both made of the same material. They both belong to the same kind of immediate situation, but they represent different epochs. They represent kind of two different moments in a genealogy of
this kingdom of her, and of Christianity, and so that's how I kind of sum up my orientation to new and old, which is that these are terms that shift as we need them to. Things become new, not because they haven't been invented before, because we unwrap them, and they're kind of virginal that way, but because it's just taken a different form. And in fact, the idea of newness is really, as you know, foundational to capitalism and relying on desire and all kinds of things, and the idea of innovation, right? That newer things are better than older things, and right. And partly this is inspired by the artists that I'm looking at, who are looking at obsolescence as something to move towards, right? Something that can be revolutionary and anti-colonial and anti-capitalist and so on.
Yeah, I think you kind of go into that with in chapter 3 when you talk about the song and how it's copyrighted, and that it gets played was it only once that it got played, and then it's kind of dispersed into multiple different like, is it hard drivers? I wasn't quite sure. Was it hard drives that it's separated into?
And this is when I'm going to reveal my limited understanding of technology. It is played, and actually maybe Lee can help us in the chat with this. It's a Max MSP program, and Max MSP is a very common program, but it's a live play system. And so what they did, the artists took hundreds of versions of the song "The Lion Sleeps Tonight," one of the most iconic generic signifiers of Africa. He found all of the different versions of those and cut it up into little pieces, and then created this program on Max MSP that would self-select similar versions or similar cuts of the versions, and reassemble the original version of the song that was recorded in the 30s in Johannesburg. It was an incredibly popular song with mine workers in Johannesburg. And the person who originally recorded that song was paid 50 cents for the copyright of that. And now it's become the Disney, the Lion King is based off of it. It's making millions and millions of dollars. And so the gesture that they were making was to kind of gesture to this return, while kind of suggesting also that that's impossible, and displacing their authorship onto the Max MSP program, and saying that that's the artist, not the two that wrote the algorithm. Does that make sense? I mean,
it makes sense to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Lee approves, so we're good.
Yeah, we're all good. We all understand it perfectly now. That kind of reminds me of something that we were talking about the other day about Paul Simon. And you talk very specifically about his album Graceland, and Ladysmith Black Mambazo. And so I was wondering, perfect explanation.
All right.
You're doing great. So when we talked about it last time, we talked about how a lot of the artworks that you use are pidgin language objects, and that is inherently tied to the fetish. I was wondering if you could maybe reiterate talking about the fetish and the pidgin language in the context of Paul Simon's Graceland.
Oh God, that's a really good and difficult question, because yes, it's true that I argue that there's a certain class of mediation that really is transnational at birth. And the fetish, as various scholars, not me, as various scholars that I was reading, argue that the fetish, and for those of you who don't know this history, there's a class of objects that scholars early exploration days were incredibly interested in, these what they called fetish objects, which comes from the Portuguese term petiço, which means to make with one's hand or something. The suggestion is that it's fake, right? It's created, it's made. And this class of objects the new scholarship on this class of objects says that these are objects born of the cross-cultural encounter between European explorers and traders and African explorers and traders. And that originally that fetish came up in sort of a cosmopolitan moment. And this predates the slave trade. But as the slave trade starts to ramp up, that fetish object becomes an accusation. It becomes part of, it really becomes foundational to racism as we know it. And so taking all of those things into account, there is this class of objects, and a lot of it is what we consider new media art, computers like what we're using now, that exist in this transnational space or exist in this middle space. They're not original to any one culture, but they really represent an in-between thing, right? And so I'm mapping, the media objects also onto this idea of mediation between cultures, countries, lands. It's a way of bridging distance that's geographical and cultural. So when you talk about things like even The Lion Sleeps Tonight, that original Mbube was the original title of the song. That was a song that was developed also in a transnational space. It was made by Zulu miners, but they were listening to minstrel songs from the United States. This is how they came up with this type of, so it's a song, but it's also a type of choir music that Ladysmith sings. And Ladysmith gets picked up by Paul Simon, which is another transnational kind of, right at the moment that he's getting interested in non-Western music, which, I kind of poke at him a bit, because there is sort of a moment when a lot of white male rock stars and their careers are flagging start to look for new material. And they often go to the global South to do that. And so that album is kind of obviously, and it's been pointed out a lot, that it can be considered appropriation, but it's also kind of this magnificent album that was engineered in some really incredible ways. And so again, it's like a both and object. It's both, it's problematic racially, and it's sort of magnificent technologically.
Thank you. That was a great answer. I hit all the marks that I was looking for.
All right.
Yeba, I don't know if you have a question. But
yeah, no, when we're going off of how they're kind of taking from Africa what they want, how do you think it, when we see it from our culture industry perspective, is there another an alternative way to present it to the world, or right now it all feels like appropriation? So how are we as consumers supposed to look at it?
It's such an important question. And I think part of why I wrote this book is because I was trying to figure that out. Because I don't, when you talk, Graceland has been turned over and over in discussion, just for this very reason. Was it appropriation? Was it racist for him to do this? And it was a huge conversation and debate within South Africa. I think that's important to understand, that South Africans were really trying to figure it out. It was also complicated because the year that it was recorded, in 1985 and 1986, was really a pitched battle within South Africa to overthrow the apartheid government, the white supremacist government there, that had been, ruling for about 40 years. But before that, hundreds of years with colonialism. And there was a cultural boycott, a global cultural boycott. Musicians were not supposed to go there and, profit off of this system. And Paul Simon went anyway. And he did so kind of with the stated intention of breaking this blockade so that he could highlight what was happening there. And the Black musicians who collaborated with him said the same thing. We're here to collaborate. We don't consider ourselves victims of this. We had fun. They became huge stars, as we know. Ladysmith, Black Mambazo became huge global stars. but this is never, you know, this conundrum has never gone away. We know that people, and so what I hope I do in that chapter is to show that those issues don't matter as much unless it's about private property, right? That actually, you know, the original singer of the song probably wouldn't have known or cared that much unless there was private property at stake, right? Like collaboration becomes appropriation when somebody else is profiting from it. And so that was what the lawsuit was about. Solomon Linda, the family of the person who originally recorded the song, successfully sued Disney for copyright. And it became this landmark case because previous to that, you know, songwriters have always done this where they claim something is a folk melody. And by claiming something is folk, you're claiming that you're saying that nobody owns it. No one person owns it. It's not private property. And so often that folk moniker is used in order to steal, right? And so that was definitely the case with these songwriters here in the United States, that they just kept narrating this thing like, oh, it's a Zulu song, you know, we can sample it at will. Nobody's losing anything. And so finally the Solomon Linda case was like, no, this is, you know, this was a song, it was recorded, he was paid for the copyright, but it was under very inequitable conditions, right? So yes, that's what I'm saying, is that issues of appropriation become issues of appropriation when there is kind of an argument about ownership. And Jenny Lee says, folk also sounds antithetical to the modern or modernism. Exactly. And so folk is folded into this idea of primitivism, that it really becomes named and it becomes a concept at the moment that it starts to serve these purposes. And that is in the modern period. And increasingly with the development of media, right? Phonographs and, minstrelsy and minstrel music here was totally coterminous with the recording industry here.
And on the topic of music again, because you talk about it a lot in your book, you talk about the first work of electronic music, or like a predecessor to it, in Tabir al-Zar.
I think Tabir al-Zar.
Okay. Yep. And I was wondering, as a work of like, in thinking of it as potentially a predecessor to electronic music, and I have never heard of this object before. How does that potentially change the history of electronic music in acknowledging the history there and thinking about it as this specific object that came from Egypt?
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious what you think about that. Do you think it changes the story? That was the question that I begin the chapter with, is, does this matter? Are we going to rewrite the history of electronic music? Probably not. I'm trying to, but will it penetrate that field of media studies? I don't know. We'll see. I think one of the things that's difficult is once you start to identify the problems with genealogies, you sort of have this moment of the afterwards, like the now what moment. And you all know that we're living with this in art history right now. Amelia and I talked about this a lot in our class, where we're dealing with the aftermath of kind of a destroyed set of references, and that work is exciting, but then we have to figure out what to do after that. I think there are ways, there are models that exist. Siegfried Zielinski, who's a media scholar that I cite in the introduction, says he calls this I'm forgetting his term for it, but basically like a diversity of media histories, and that one could assemble a sort of constellation of media histories. That attends to both the specificity of where those things are coming from, but also this very idea of the fetish, or the in-between space, or the shared space, the shared mediation of objects like computers, things that become common all over the world.
And so this fetish concept as like a method of interpretation, it could apply to interpreting like works outside of Africa too.
I think so. I think so. And in the introduction, I acknowledge that there's a danger of this, because for years also, especially African art history scholars have wanted to make sure that we leave that term behind because of its racism. So I make sure that I say very, very clearly in the introduction that if we are to use this as a concept or kind of like an ancestor media object, we have to be clear about what we're saying with that, which is that it's foundational to racism. And that's also what I mean in this idea of the Atlantic world, right? When I speak about media and art history being formed in the crucible of the Atlantic world, I'm directly referencing the slave trade and this conjugation of bodies that I spoke about earlier. So, but I do want to know what you both think of this idea. Like, what do you think about, if you're going to switch one person out for another as being the first person, because we know that art historians, like any historian, loves to declare a first, right? Does it matter?
I am actually talking about this in a totally different class, but about hip hop. But I was looking into what I actually thought about it, and I realized that what I care about is knowing about individuals rather than giving I guess I was talking about credit. And I think there's this tendency to give credit to whole communities or whole countries that produce things. And I realized that I definitely prefer knowing the individual in question who developed something. And obviously the community that they produce it in is important, but I think there is a danger in doing that because then you get close to generalization. And yeah. I'm not sure if that's something that I particularly value.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, for me, I think that the greatness lies in like the transhistoric category of whatever happened before. So it has to build up against one another. It can't just come out of nowhere. So I think the argument that like this is where electronic music started, I think it's brilliant, because why not? Why not make it your own? Why not take ownership over it? Well, not really ownership, but like claim it and put it out there. Like I think that's the one thing about your book that's kind of inspires me as an art historian, because like I can do that too. Delinda does it, I can do it too.
Great. Yeah, I mean, it's fun. It's always, that's kind of the fun part about being a historian, is when you actually have one of those moments, those are hard to find. And again, it wasn't as though I was the one who declared him the first. It was it was Wire magazine who did. And I just happened to kind of browse it. I think that's becoming a better known fact within kind of, but still within those small circles of electronic music, which, as we know, are very small circles. But those people who care about those things. And one of my hopes also, by assembling all of these different media types, is they also begin, all of these weird subfields of media studies start to talk to each other, which is also why I began the book with film. And because arguably that's not part of new media. It's not part of art history. It's not, it's not considered a single artist's work, but I think all of these ways of mediation, all of these kinds of ways of getting to the elements of what mediation is, are interesting together here.
Yeah, but you want to go?
So Dylan, do you think that like new media would have a better name? I don't think it's new, but do you think it would have a better like translation if it encompassed everything together? And is there a word for that?
Yeah, I mean, as you now know, I use a lot of cognates, or I just kind of create a whole constellation of terms. Tech art gets used a lot in the book. And I always have to signal that, yes, each of these terms has its own sort of subfield history. And so it gets a little bit exhausting to always flag those things, but it's also, to me, an interesting task to be able to kind of cross boundaries. So yeah, I would say if I had to just keep talking about it shorthand today, I would probably just keep saying tech art or media art.
And that kind of ties.
And challenge people, right? I mean, because even at our school, as we know, ATS and FBNMA are different departments, right? And based on these different genealogies of the art.
And also, just to reiterate, if anybody has any questions, participants, you can put them in the chat and we will answer them soon-ish, because we only have like 15 minutes left.
What? Yeah. Really? Wow.
I know, right? Really going quick. And that kind of brings me to my next question, Delinda, which is, so you talk about a lot of different influences. I mean, you've talked a lot about different influences, like your graduate class, and I mean, Wired magazine and you describe art history at itself as a pidgin language. And so how do you think that has translated into your own work, like philosophically, as like an influencer in itself? Do you think that it's made it a lot more challenging, or do you think that understanding it as all of these different mixings of things have made it more fulfilling or something?
I would say both. Yeah, both things are true. It's challenging, but I think in the best way possible. I think, I don't know if it comes out pretty clearly in the introduction, but African art history has been, it's a very young field. It only really, the first PhD was awarded in the United States in 1958. So that's, in terms of disciplines, that's pretty young. And it's always been based on what I consider, and this is now me generalizing because there's a lot of diversity within that field of approaches. But at least in the beginning, it was really based on this idea of a hermetic tribe producing a type of art, right? And it was for a long time that simple. And it was actually my advisor, Sydney Casper, who just passed away in January. She wrote this really groundbreaking article in 1984 called One Tribe, One Style with a question mark. And in that article went about really dismantling this myth of a tribe, a stable tribe that remains to itself, hermetic, and it's a tautology to say that a tribe produces a style and the style can be used to identify the tribe. So she was pointing out this circular logic in the field of African art history, saying, in a sense that denies history exists there. It denies that not only that people migrate, but also that things change over time, right? And so that's always been kind of a foundational article for me. And so what it does is to me, to give us this really empowered place that we can come from as historians, where we kind of identify moments of change, moments where languages start to merge, when they start to pull apart, how people in different positions use the same things to do different things, right? And I think, if you just embrace that, it's a really fun way of writing, because there is no one right way to do this type of work. And then in the end, it becomes almost like an interpretive activity. I think Jim Elkins talks about this a lot, that it's, in a sense, when you're doing art history, you're writing, you're a writer, and you should embrace that. You should embrace the kind of poeticism of that act. And to acknowledge that what you're doing is also kind of adding a different type of mediation to that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Jenny has we want to go to Jenny's question, or do you?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. General question about the notion that modernism conjugates bodies, which is super fascinating. I hear this and I think of conjugating verbs, putting objects into the past or future, conditional tense. Ooh, I like that. How does modernism in your book function in a comparable way in relation to the bodies or communities that you discussed, particularly as these occupy or produce in transnational spaces? Whew, that's a great question, Jenny. Well, I think one of the recurring themes of the book, and it's almost in every single chapter. No, this is a great question. It's not too general. A recurring theme is mining. And so one of the kind of through lines of the book is industrial mining and extractive mining. And so both in a literal sense, like these are the industries that shape modernism on the continent, but also extrapolating that into a whole philosophy of being and of producing and of what things are, what bodies are for, right? Because this is such a deep history on the continent that it's fundamentally shaped modernism there. So in that sense, it's really easy to just observe the way it's conjugated Black bodies on the continent, right? But then extrapolating from there, how do just general theories of extraction and mining and production conjugate all of us, right? How do we understand our bodies in relation to products and art? And, do we understand our body as an object? What are the boundaries of that body? And so on. And so I think, yeah, that's the mining thing becomes a literal way of doing the history, but also a metaphorical way of talking about how one thing becomes another thing. And transmutation, allegory works in the same way, metaphor works in a similar way, as one thing transfers into another thing. I hope that kind of answered it, but yeah, I'm riffing.
Made sense to me.
All right.
It also kind of brought up another question for me, specifically about one of your chapters titled Film as Light and Light as Indigenous. And that analogy really got me thinking about the ways that you could connect to, like, in some ways, unconnected things. And I was wondering what, in titling it that and in making it this very specific chapter about Yelen, how film is, I mean, not to ask just like, is film indigenous to Africa, but like, yeah. How film and light become analogous, really.
Exactly, yeah. And yeah, and so, and this is where it's interesting because I'm not a film historian in any way or film theorist, but I had to go through all that material when I was writing this chapter and decide how much to plunge into it. And because in some ways, film history and theory has a really much more developed understanding of the substance of its medium. And so light has long been a theme within film theory. That's the substance of film because it's literally projecting light, but also that's its beingness, right? So in a very philosophically, rooted way, that light is what's indigenous to film, or it's what the material is. And what Yelen does, and Suleiman Sisse, the filmmaker, is Malian. He's from Mali, but he's trained in the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, it's a whole history of African filmmakers being schooled there. When he comes back and starts to do these various social realist films in the 70s, to kind of protest certain inequities that the government is starting to provide the people, he realizes that there's kind of an endpoint to what he can achieve by making the content about certain things. And instead with Yelen, he takes this step back and does what's tremendously idiosyncratic in his work, which is to do a movie about this 13th century tale in Mali. And it's a folk tale, and it's one that's told and narrated, but it's also about the greatness of Mali, and why it's considered an empire and why it's, such an important place. And so everybody's had a theory about why he did that. Why did he do this film? Was he trying to embed his criticism? Was this a metaphor for the bad government? Of question. But again, nobody had asked that question. The film is called, it's light. That word means light in Bambara, you know. Why did he make a film called Light? And then in one really key scene in the film, at the apex of the film, he blinds out the whole screen and whitens it out. Y'all have to watch this film because it's really excellent. But in that culminating scene, he blocks out the entire screen. It turns white with light, right? And just for like 5 seconds, you don't see anything else on the screen except light. And you're kind of trapped, if you have to imagine yourself as, you know, occupying a space be in front of the projector, but behind the screen, that you're sort of bathed in that light, right? And so there's that. There's, again, the kind of material of film that gets distributed. But he also was really insistent in filming and putting the camera actually physically in the middle of Mali, in the hardest place on earth to film. And it also happens to be the closest to the equator of almost anywhere else on earth. And so in Bambara folklore, this is called the bright country or the light country. And he's saying, if I just put my camera here and let it do that work naturally of capturing that light and not trying to mediate it with different, artificial lights or electric lights, which is really unusual when you're a filmmaker in the 80s to try to, go without all of those apparatuses of film. Just to record that, right, is something that he's arguing would make it indigenous, because it's registering what's exactly there. It's not trying to come up with any content of Africa, that can be told. It's not about content at all. It's about registering that specific light that you can't get anywhere else, right? And so where all of the debates, it's not just about Yalin, but about African film generally, it's always the question is like, what makes it indigenous? Is it indigenous? Is it a Western import? Does that make it less authentic? Often people will say, well, what makes it indigenous is that it tells stories, and Africans have always told stories. And that's, one of the arguments is that that type of storytelling is African. And I sort of wanted to include that and respect that, but also get into what literally makes it indigenous, or what, if we could say that it was literally indigenous.
Thank you. Yabet, do we have 2 minutes left?
Yeah, I think we do. We have a little bit of time left. I think, Delinda, goes to in your intro where you say, like, hovering between accuracies as an art historical and ethical value and pure fantasy or hallucination, African art embodied a pure other that was at once recognizably art and outside of the Western tradition. So I like how you capitalize other. What is the other?
Well, that's a good one. Other with a capital O has a lot of different uses. What I generally mean is the civilizational other. And, there are a lot of different discourses that take up this word. Psychoanalysis takes it up as, the other to your self, basically, like self-other. But on a civilizational scale, it's often used as shorthand for people that are not like you, either in culture or in skin tone, or and so in the colonial situation, it also has a particular use in post-colonial theory. Post-colonial studies has a very particular use as kind of pitting civilizations against one another, and usually West, non-West, right? Or West-East, or North-South, global North, global South, or first, second, third world, all of these different mechanisms that we've come up to do this. So other is kind of a generic way to indicate that difference, or that act of differentiating, right? I think Lee had okay, let's see. I want to just read Lee's question real quick. The previous thread was really interesting because in an artist, I had assumed that the way that we attach ourselves to tribe helps point out writers and artists towards one another and help us to locate fellow travelers. What do you think about these identities that we attach ourselves to as media artists? Are these descriptors somehow reinforcing some form of regionalism or nationalism, or some kind of ism based on who has been erased from art history? Wow, this is a great question. Do the artists you write about use identifying labels? That's a really good question. Because I think all of these artists have problems with those titles in some way or another, or they struggle with those titles. One of the artists, James Webb, that I write about, doesn't like to be called a tech or sound artist. He wants to be called an artist who uses sound, you know, and so there's a lot of modifiers that he does. Several of them just don't care, like they don't address it at all. They just consider themselves, I guess, just artists or scientists, or some don't even want to be called artists, right? But this idea of tribes is really interesting because it's, I guess, what I am doing in the book without realizing it is saying that there is some sort of comparable, you can, you know, there's some analogous kind of way of talking about tribes as in, you know, people tribes or sociological units, and disciplines, right? Art history, media studies, sound art, whatever kind of tribe within the art world that we identify with based on medium. So, but that's really fascinating. I'll have to think about that more.
All these people in the chat upstaging me.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. No, it's great.
No.
We're all in this together.
Yeah.
Well, that was a great conversation. We
Thank
do
you
have to
both
cut
so
it off.
much. These are
Thank you, Delinda.
such excellent questions, and I appreciate this is my first, you know, talk about the book, so I'm just thrilled.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.